Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. You probably just heard that recording will be in process throughout this meeting. So just kind of keep your ears out and eyes out for that. We're going to spend some time letting a few more people roll in, and then we'll get started in a few minutes. In the meantime, if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you and learn more about who you are. All right, so I'll talk to you all later.
Is everyone keeping warm?
Yes.
Good to see you, Madam. Glad you're joining us.
My thermometer right here, it says it's 19 outside,
Oh, yeah.
and that's in the sun.
Well, thank God Mother Nature hasn't forgotten about us completely.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so new admissions are kind of slowing down into the room, so I think we can start getting rolling on this seminar. So welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Ritter, and I'm the project manager at the Partnership for Faith-Based Affordable Housing and Community Development, and I work with the organizations Bricks and Mortals and the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative on different affordable housing issues and pre-development support. We're excited to see you all here, and we will be having a seminar focusing on kind of the steps we take in pre-development to assess what we might be able to do with our congregation's property and assets, and also what sorts of things we might want to do. So I'm going to take a few moments to let a few of my colleagues introduce themselves and tell you a bit more about their work, and then we'll kind of launch into more content. I'm joined today by Mark Greenberg. Mark, would you take a moment to say hey?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin, and welcome, everyone. I see we have almost 50 people joining us, and hopefully we have a few more. It's great to see you all. So I'm Mark Greenberg. I'm the executive director of the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing. Been doing this work for almost 40 years, working with housing and homelessness. But with Peter Cook and Kate Toth, and now Kevin and others, we formed the Partnership for Faith-Based Affordable Housing and Community Development. And we also are part of, I'm the president, Peter, the vice president of the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative. So we work on a lot of issues that relate to homelessness and housing, and that congregations can engage themselves in. But today, we really want to drill down in helping congregations to determine if there's a possibility of developing housing on your property. And then later in the conversation, I'll talk a little bit more about some other options that congregations may have with regard to advocacy and other ways that we can really impact positively on those who are homeless and at risk of homelessness. But I just wanted to welcome everyone here, and really glad you're joining us.
Thanks, Mark. And we're also joined by Kate Toth of Bricks and Mortals. Would you say a bit about you and your work, Kate?
Hi, yeah, and thanks everyone for joining us and Kevin for directing our conversation today. So I'm Kate Toth, the Executive Director of Bricks and Mortals. Bricks and Mortals is a secular interfaith membership organization comprised of individuals and organizations from faith-based institutions and real estate experts. We provide creative and sustaining solutions to help houses of worship thrive amidst the costly and challenging landscape of operating in New York City, as many, if not most of you that work in New York will understand. And this includes experts and financial resources. You can find out more information about the kind of work that we do and the resources we provide at bricksandmortals.org.
Great. And then finally, we're joined by Peter Cook from the New York Society of Churches. Peter, would you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I'm Peter Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches. We are comprised of 9 denominations and represent about 7,000 congregations across the state of New York. We've been around since the late 19th century, founded first as the New York Sunday School Association. We work on helping give congregations tools to act in the public square. And also consistent with that mission is how they can use their property to serve their communities. And we also certify and support chaplains in the state prison system. So I'm also Vice President of the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, which is the vehicle we use to give pre-development loans to congregations to help them repurpose their property. And this is all part of the partnership that we share with Bricks and Mortals, Interfaith Assembly, Interfaith and the Interfaith Assembly on homelessness and housing.
Great.
So I'm very pleased to be here today.
All right. Thank you, Peter. So we're really happy you all are here. We will be having a few times for questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to just write any questions you have in the chat as they come up, because we'll be covering them throughout the presentation, not just at the end. So whenever you have them, just write them in. And today we'll also be joined by Jason Labate of Goldstein Hall and Rob Crowderoff, who will be speaking about solar energy and energy efficiency in your building. So with that, I think we can start getting started. So we know that many of you who are here may be involved with a congregation that's really curious about pursuing development, either affordable housing or some other form of development, and using your property to do that. And this seminar is going to cover what a development process looks like. At the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, we have a 6-phase process that we use with congregations that we work with. And today we're really going to focus on this primarily on the first step of this process, that of discernment, which is when a congregation takes a look at their property and their mission and decides what sort of development might work well for them, both missionally and sort of financially and legally. And to start off this conversation, I really wanted to talk with Peter a bit about development's interaction with the congregation's mission. And Peter's prepared a few slides to talk through this really important topic. And Peter, will you take it away?
Great. Thank you, Kevin, so much. Many of you may have been approached at one time or another by a developer who might want to help you develop property or do something with your property. But it's really important that before you enter into a conversation like that, that you're clear about your mission as a congregation. So we often talk in terms of who is my neighbor? This is the question that Jesus asked, often as a way to stretch us to reach out to others in our communities, to reach out to the stranger, to reach out to the Samaritans in our midst, all kinds of people. Who is my neighbor? So next slide. So historically, we really discover God when we reach out to our communities. And keep going. And a lot of times that mission is embodied in how we structure our physical space. In the medieval period, for instance, the cathedral was the center of the community. It was a gathering place for the community, but it also facilitated and spawned economic activity and social connection all around it. In New England, we also see that kind of an open architecture, that communally based architecture. We have Congregationalists rebelling against the King of England, forming towns, which, according to the law at the time, required that a congregation or meeting house be constructed before a town could be formed. So therefore, the church, or in this case was called a meeting house, needed to be connected to the community. And often these meeting houses were in town greens where people to graze their sheep or schooled their kids or engaged in commerce in some way. In the United States, later on, we see the advent of things like camp meetings sponsored by Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians and others, where the church was really brought out into the community, sometimes as part of summer revivals. So I'm sure you all could find yourself in this picture. But some of you maybe have had experiences going to revivals more recently. In the late 19th and early 20th century, we saw the advent of the social gospel, which had some of its origins in upstate New York, and it really embraced the idea that the church was not so much about converting individuals to accept Jesus. It wasn't so much on individual conversion, but instead the church offering the gospel by changing the society around it to be more welcoming to children and the disenfranchised. So really, we talk about the work of the church as being one of social conversion. And we also saw this in the Great Depression, where congregations all across the country, but particularly in the Mississippi Delta, interestingly enough, we really concluded that the church could not rely on dispensing charity alone, but that they had to influence public policy, which led to the creation of the New Deal and calling on the government to take responsibility for the safety net. And so things like Social Security today and so on, reflect those efforts made by religious communities to influence policy. By the 1950s, I think we saw a not so healthy vision of the church moving more inward. It was more obsessed with the idea of serving its members who came to the church as opposed to serving their communities. So the 1950s is often lifted up as sort of the heyday of church growth and expansion, but it was really premised a lot on how we attract people to the church. And in the process, I think we forgot some of the more social gospel leanings of churches in earlier periods. I think this has turned into an extreme where, as you're trying to focus on your membership, you start to create a fortress in your church or your congregation, where you start to wall people off. We have fences that go up, doors that don't open, security systems in place. And I can kind of help reinforce the sense that the church is kind of like a religious country club. So we really, I think what we're trying to say here is we have to reconsider what the church, what congregations of all faiths are about here. And really how it is that we take an interest in the people around us in our communities who might be disenfranchised. And of course, some of those people could be people who come to our congregations every Sunday. A lot of times there are people sitting in our pews in a lot of pain, experiencing economic dislocation, really struggling to meet their expenses. And we also have that kind of a dynamic out in our communities. And unfortunately, we still build our cities and our congregations a lot of times around ideas of segregation rather than doing communal design that facilitates connection with the wider community. So in summary, really, faith communities are much healthier, we think, when they look outward. And we literally die as congregations if we're not reaching out to others to contribute to our communities. And as we invest in relationships in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our cities, we really open up a whole vast array of people with whom we are connecting and not limit ourselves to those who just show up in our congregations on Saturday or on Sunday morning. So again, we should, I think, reclaim our vision of the congregation as a parish, where parish is defined as the whole neighborhood and not just our own congregation within our four walls. And when we reach out in this way, we start to build trust. We start to grow together, and we also become more aware of resources that can help strengthen our church buildings and our ministries. So we also think that this improves the mental health of our communities when we as congregations can facilitate connections between people to break down the experiences that people have of isolation. So we're better off when we move from an inward to an outward focus, when we advocate for policies and laws which include people in our communities and where we build relationships and advocate for the world that God wants for us in the public square. And when we do that work, then what starts to appear are the best possibilities. We start to understand better the possibilities for how we should best use our property. So that's some context, and
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's really a sort of lot to chew on. We have some time for questions now. I don't see any in the chat, but does anyone have anything they want to speak aloud? If not, I have a question too, so. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions, but Peter, I'm curious what you might say. I know some congregations have members that like still really like ascribe to and feel strongly about this sort of country club model that you're pushing against. As you're like a congregation, like how do you kind of get on all on the same page about what your mission is and be like aligned as a group?
Well, first of all, let's be honest, not everybody is going to get on the same page. And part of the conflict we have in congregations is that when people show up, they have competing ideas of why they're even there. So, just to be honest, that defining your mission is not always very easy, but in my experience, if you can try to get a number of people in your congregation, not just the religious leader, but a number of folks to start reaching out into the community and building relationships, that will help to inform your mission. It's you know, how you as a congregation allocate your time is 100% of your time devoted to just taking care of the people within your four walls, or how much of that is devoted to caring for people in your neighborhood, some of who may never show up in your congregation. So I think you just start to live into this, and at some point try to codify that in a mission statement. But a lot of times your mission is already pretty clearly stated. If you go back and look at the history of your church or your congregation, how did you start, is a really good thing to look at. And sometimes going back to the way things used to be and returning to the original reason that you came into being in the first place is a helpful exercise.
Great, thank you, Peter. Does anyone else have questions?
Kevin, if I just want to echo what Peter said, we've found that congregations that reach outward end up being stronger.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to know what our true mission is and embrace that mission. And then I think people will recognize that and be supportive of it.
You know, another one is that a lot of people, for those of you who are pastors or rabbis here or imams, you know, you'll get people to say, you know, we just got to get more people to come to church, or, you know, come to our congregation. And I want to say absolutely. But the way you do that is you have to increase the number of relationships that you're building with people. And if you just sit in your building and hope people come, that is really reducing the number of contacts you have with individuals to try to, you know, bring the congregation's witness to them.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter, for sharing that really great sort of historical timeline and your insight into congregation's missions. I think barring any last minute questions, I'll move on now. But thank you so much. Great.
Yeah.
And we'll hear more from Peter in a moment. But now we're going to talk about kind of assessing what your assets are, which is an important step in kind of deciding what sort of development is a good fit for you. And before you launch into any project, this is something you want to be doing. And you, as a congregation, definitely have a range of assets. You might have some cash holdings, you might have other financial assets, and you also might have some sort of real estate holdings. Most often, congregations' most valuable sort of financial asset is their building. And of course, a building is also a social asset. But here we're thinking about it in sort of financial terms. And you also have a range of kind of non-financial assets, a lot of which Peter was just sort of touching on. You might have professional expertise in your congregation about sort of real estate law or architecture. You might have really robust community relationships or sorts of mission-based programs that you're undertaking in your community. And to kind of talk a little bit more about this assessment work that is really important, we have Jason Lebate here from Goldstein Hall, who's going to share a little bit from his experience as well. Okay.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. There I am. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sort of understanding your real property assets. And I've got 2 slides to do that, I think approximately 4 minutes. So the first questions to ask are sort of what property you own and how you own it, right? So here I have under ownership, who actually owns your property? And you may have internal records on this. There are in New York City and several other municipalities throughout New York, there are online resources so you can see ownership information going back to usually the 90s. But ideally, the best way to get this information will be sort of with a title report, because you want to know whether you own it, whether it's in the name you think that your church is, or your synagogue or mosque or other faith-based organization, or whether it's owned, right? For example, the Episcopal Diocese owns many of the properties on which its parishes are operating. So you really need to understand whether you own that asset or you're really just inhabiting that asset and someone else owns it. So you can determine what you can do with it. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but the questions are there restrictions on your properties? And I guess these are sort of talking about legal restrictions. So frequently, particularly on religious properties, there will be requirements that there always be a place of worship on that property. And so that has to be taken into consideration and sort of limits in a positive way, but is certainly a limit in what you can do with that property. And then of course, I don't know how much we're going to go into it today, but there's zoning and building code requirements. So is what is built on your property all that you can build? Can it only be used for specific purposes, essentially what you're doing now, or could it be a school? Could it be a senior daycare? Could it be a Starbucks, right? By way of example. These are all things that you really need to discern the value of your asset and what's possible. And then organizationally, right, you need to know, okay, well, we have this asset, not only sort of what is it, but who has the authority to determine what is to be done with it. Next slide, please, Kevin. And this is probably the most important aspect of valuing your asset or figuring out what you want to do with your asset. And I think this speaks very much to Peter's section about what is your mission, right? And so again, we're talking about your real property, but you need to understand your needs, right? And part of your needs may be your current, not on the slide, is your current operation, right? We worked with a church on a previous, who's my neighbor, who had a daycare in their property, and they members really felt strongly about maintaining the daycare. But there were a substantial portion of members that also wanted to reach out to the LGBTQ community, particularly with regard to housing. And so, right, you've got your needs; those are external needs that they identified for the community, and they wanted to maintain, but they also wanted to build on. So they were evaluating both what their internal needs were missionally and income, and with regard to income, and then what the needs of the community were. And then the last thing I'll say here is there are different ways to, quote, value your property. Right, this is America, we're capitalistic, and so everybody can put a price on anything. But right, there are different values, right? That beat up old house of worship may only garner $200,000 in the, on the marketplace, but it's really invaluable to the community with the services that it provides, with the spiritual support and refuge that it provides. And so whether or not and how that place of worship continues in that space, grows, evolves, etc., it's really important to understand sort of whose value do we want to consider here when you're determining what to do with that asset. And at the same time, realize that it might be worth $20 million to you, but if you were to, go to the marketplace, you're only going to get $200,000, and reconciling that, accepting that, and sort of computing that into your plans is really critical. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I will also say that one thing that's important in this sort of discernment process is knowing your polity, both of your congregation and kind of if you have a larger denomination. Sometimes denominations can have really sort of complicated rules and arrangements if you want to be pursuing a big change to your building, like if you're looking to partner with a developer or build a new structure. It's important for you to know what sorts of bylaws you have and what they say about who makes kind of what decisions. And the extent to, and it's also important to know kind of the extent to which you've been following these bylaws in practice. So some denominations are really hands-on and others not so much. But this is an important consideration as you're considering the sorts of legal structures and financial structures that you'll be pursuing in the development process. And Jason has some kind of more insight about legal and finance stuff. So Jason, do you want to say more?
Sure. So to underline that point, and then I guess move into the slide, is I always wonder how much I should share. So we have been involved in transactions where developers and the local church did not engage the judicatory to which they were subject and which had to approve their project until the very end, and their deal was not approved. Right, and so it is critical that you understand, to my earlier point, sort of who has the approval authority, and to make sure that they are engaged throughout this process, whatever your end result is, or your desired end result is. So to that point, right, one, review your corporate documents to determine who has the legal authority over your real property. So as I said, it's certainly going to be your board. Well, first you need to know who owns it, but assuming that your faith-based organization owns the property, presumably your board will have authority over it, but your members may have a right to vote as well, right? Some denominations members have the rights to vote, and in others they do not. And I won't get into it too much here, but right, real property transactions, sales, mortgages, and leases in excess of 5 years have to get approval either from the Attorney General and the court, or the statutorily prescribed judicatory end of the court. And so knowing what is required, depending on which of those channels your organization has to go through, is critical. So then point 2, identify an individual. I'm sorry, go back for a second, Kevin. I'll be quick. Identify an individual or small committee to work with the external team, coordinate the process, and report to the board and congregation. So we're going to talk about consultants that you'll need depending on what the scope of work is that you want to undertake with your real property. But it's critical that you identify, I think, several individuals that will regularly interact with those consultants and sort of lead the process of evaluation and exploration regarding your property, and then to report back to the board and congregation. And this is critical, right? Though that group of individuals, they should know your organization, its history, its operation, its desires, its mission. They should have the respect of others, right? If there's infighting or people they don't speak with weight, that's going to be a problem. They should be comfortable with the leadership role, and the expectation should be that they will be there with the faith-based organization for the foreseeable future. We've been in situations where leadership has taken a plan to a certain point, and then they retired, and then the plan essentially died on the vine there. Now the next slide. This is just an example. So I've been talking in the abstract about what your legal options are with regard to your property. Hopefully this is helpful. If not, erase it from your memory. But on the left-hand axis is your options for legal commitments regarding your property, right? A license is you allow AA to come in twice a week to perform meetings. They should be doing that ideally pursuant to a license. A lease is the next, which is you have a tenant, a daycare, a school, a kitchen, soup kitchen, etc. And that would be an exclusive right. And it could be for a number of months or a number of years. And then the greatest legal commitment obviously would be a ground lease or a sale. And then on the bottom, the financial commitment and risk, and this doesn't necessarily have to be for the faith-based organization. It could also be for a developer, a tenant, or another sort of partner. But in general, the financial commitment and risk also increases, as you can see, as you go up the legal commitment. The smallest being sort of renovations. If you want to remove the pews, for instance, right, that could have a limited financial risk. Repurposing is really more of a gut renovation, might even be some small new construction. And then development usually considers, really intensive, either new construction, renovation, addition, etc. And that comes with requirement for guarantees, experience, and those sorts of things. Next slide, Kev. I really just want to say this enough to scare you and know that you understand that these are some considerations. So if you're a faith-based organization, you are exempt from income tax. However, if you engage in a business or actions that are profit-making that are unrelated to your mission, that income is taxable. That's UBIT, unrelated business income tax. And so there are exceptions to this. There's something called the passive real property income exemption. And so if you are renting out property and you are not using, there's not debt on that property, then that passive income, that rent, is exempt from UBIT. But you really want to make sure that you've evaluated this if you are engaging in a real property transaction. Same thing in New York State, there's an exemption for real property taxes, right? The rest of us jokers pay real property tax. I do on my house. But faith-based organizations, if property is owned by a faith-based organization or a not-for-profit or charitable organization and operated for exempt purposes, religious, charitable, etc., then it can be exempt from real property tax. But if it is used for non-exempt purposes or rented to someone, that's not an exempt entity, that property will be taxable. And so you want to make sure that this is you've evaluated this in your plan. Next slide, please. And this is just to sort of open your mind in terms of legal structure. So, you might look at your property and say, look, we've got, I'll show you the example in a second. We cover almost our entire lot. How could we possibly improve what we own, or how could a developer develop on our site and not mess with our current operation? Right? So in that instance, you might want to split a lot, which is not here. You might want to create condominiums, which is just three-dimensional ownership spaces on within one building. You may, and this is Episcopal diocese, and many of the mainline Protestant organizations have a strong preference. It's not a requirement, if not a requirement, that property not be sold, but rather ground leased. Trinity, for instance, does a lot of this with the property that they own. And the benefit here is, one, it can be regularly income producing, and two, at the end of the lease, the property reverts back to you. So for faith-based organizations that tend to think in terms of centuries, whereas developers think in terms of quarters or years, usually not decades, but sometimes, a ground lease is fine for them and acceptable to them and good for you, because in 100 years, you want the property back. And then these other item 3, sponsorship, right of first refusal. And then there's also, not listed here, but community facility space, are all benefits that you might get in affordable housing that may not be available elsewhere. I won't go in depth here. I just want you to sort of know the terms so that if it's appropriate for you, you can explore them as you're exploring your use of your real property. So the last 2 slides, Kevin, let's do this. So this will give you an example of the legal structures. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see what looks like a church, and in fact is a church. This is St. James Fordham, a project on which I and my firm worked, and we're very proud of. And to the left is just a rendering. It's not the complete, it's not the as-built yet. It's in process of being built, but they ground leased their property in order to build that large building to the left, right next to the church that you see, to build affordable and supportive housing. So next slide, Kevin. And this really gives you a sense of it. So this shot is looking from the church now inside of that building, and what they managed to create pursuant to those legal structures after going through all the evaluations of the asset that we talked about earlier, was to A, implement a ground lease, B, put affordable housing into the project. There was already a not-for-profit developer, so they did not, they were not able to benefit from sponsorship or a right of first refusal for the project, but that would have been available if they didn't, if there was not a not-for-profit developer. And then they engaged in a condominium structure. So you'll see on the right-hand side is the end of the landmark church, and next to that is a one-story community facility. They were able to have this community facility sort of, because it's for secular uses, leverage governmental sources, and it is a condominium which will be leased and ultimately owned by the church. And the church has use of the courtyard, and there's actually a balcony above that space. So this is just to sort of, this is not going to be the right fit for everyone, but this is just to give you a sense of what's possible in evaluating your asset, because they had a 40-year-old annex that they demolished in order to create this, and really leveraged expertise and their vision to benefit the community and ensure their long-term viability. Thank you, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Jason. Thank you for, as always, sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. Great, so next we're going to talk about kind of 4 different tracks that congregations sometimes decide to pursue as development on their property. And these are affordable housing, adaptive reuse strategies, energy efficiency, and also advocacy work. And we'll kind of start by talking through affordable housing solutions. Peter, could you tell us a little more about what this can look like?
So before I do that, I just wanted to pause here and speak as directly as I can as a former pastor of a congregation who has experienced having all kinds of people come and sell us on what we should or shouldn't be doing with our property. So I certainly don't want to have you feel overwhelmed by what we've shared here. So just to be very clear, this is a teaser for you, and we will take you through some very specific steps to ensure that you've covered this material, to look at all of your options, to look at your mission, and to have somebody help you take an initial look at your options, your property, your leadership strength, and your polity. All that happens in phase one through a very structured conversation process that you would have with us, which begins with a phone call to Kevin Ritter, where we would have a follow-up with you. So having said that, we talk in terms of 4 options that congregations will want to consider as they look at their property. 1 is building affordable housing, 2, adaptive reuse, 3, energy use, and 4, trying to make an impact in their community. So I'm going to focus on track number 1, which is affordable housing that you're building on your property. So some congregations have property which could be repurposed to build affordable housing. In order to make that happen, you have to have enough property to build enough units to make that possible. As low as 20, 40 would be better, 60, 80 would be even better. It's possible that you could go smaller than that, but it would be a different sort of financing path and structure that you would be following. The other option is for you to acquire property to build affordable housing. This was in fact done by the Tree of Life development as part of First Presbyterian Church in Jamaica Plain, and also the Church of God in East Flatbush, where they acquired property and then turned around to build affordable housing. And so those are 2 options, but just to remember that your greatest asset is what you own. It's not so much what's in your bank account, although that's helpful, but it's really what are the possibilities with your property. And we'll take you through a set of questions that help evaluate whether that's a path you should be pursuing or not in phase 1. So let's move to
great.
the next person.
Thank you, Peter. So next we're going to hear from Kate of Bricks and Mortars, who will be talking to us about adaptive reuse strategies.
Hi. So like Kevin said, I'm going to be talking about adaptive reuse, which is basically everything you do on your property that isn't a full redevelopment. If you remember back to Jason's graphic, it's the first 2 on the bottom and not the last, i.e. you have options other than developing affordable housing, and you can talk to them about us. Talk to us about them. So I think about adaptive reuse in 3 categories broadly. The first is thinking about how to use your space differently. The second is sharing or renting your space. And the third is partially redeveloping your space, which is renovating or developing only a portion of your property. So if you're thinking about how to use your current space differently, some examples that congregations have done already include opening a community health center in their building, doing food programming, which I know many people probably on this call already do. This includes food pantries, but also gardening programs if you have the space, which is a way to involve the community. Doing a solar energy conversion, which I think we'll be talking about in just a moment. One of the benefits of this is that it can save you money for work on other community projects that your congregation is interested in supporting, or hosting or running a daycare or school. If you're interested in sharing or renting your space, this is a really good option, and you can do this by a space lease and rental program. This can be used to diversify the revenue that's coming into your congregation. And you can rent to mission-aligned organizations like community groups, arts organizations, local groups, and or commercial organizations as well. And this is often done on a sliding scale, with groups that can't afford to pay as much paying less, and commercial organizations and companies paying more. Judson Memorial Church in New York City, where Bricks and Mortals is based, is a really good example of this. But pre-pandemic, there were approximately 2,700 weekly visitors to the space, not including people that were going to services there. These were just community users of the space, with about 50 events per week. And they shared the space on a yearly basis with 181 groups. And those groups were in arts, justice, and worship, and split pretty evenly across those 3 categories, just to give you an idea of the kind of usage of that space. And they also shared that space with 5 congregations. In the Faith Communities Today study that was released in 2020, that said that 18% of congregations nationally are doing this, sharing their spaces with other congregations, renting it out to them on a long-term basis. So that's something that you might want to consider. And the third option or bucket that I mentioned is partially redeveloping your space. And Jason had mentioned, I think you might have been thinking about the same example that I was mentioning, because I was going to mention an example that I think he was involved in, which is St. Andrew's Church in New York City, which created emergency housing for LGBTQ youth. They partnered with the Ali Forney Center to create a 16-bed shelter. I just really love that example, so I like to bring it up. So that's a way to not fully renovate your space, but look at how you can use part of that space to serve a community that you'd like to reach. So with these, there are a lot of options if you want to think about how to use your property differently. Okay, so next slide, please. So for any option you're considering, I want to stress, and like Peter said, and I think you've heard with all the speakers, you're in control of this process, and you should feel that way. You have a huge asset, which is your property, and you can find the right partners to work with you and figure out what you and your congregation want to do with it to serve you and your needs. And it's just important to keep that in mind. Next slide. So these 2 slides just provide some general guidance and food for thought about how to approach the adaptive reuse process. Some of them I've kind of gone into, imagining the congregations in your building and sharing space and the kind of groups you can share with. So I won't go through them one by one, but I want to key in on a couple of points. If you could just go to the next slide. Thanks. So the earlier you start talking about this, the better. The more control you'll feel about the process, the less rush you'll feel. This will take time for your congregation to make a decision about how you want to move forward. And so you can, if the earlier you start, the more measured that decision will be, because this is a really important asset for you and for your congregation. And also start to think about your building as an asset, or that it could be, and not just a burden, which many people feel because it's so hard to maintain. And starting to think about your building as an asset will change the dynamic and how you approach these conversations overall. So I think that wraps up my section, but I hope this was a helpful introduction to adaptive reuse, what those projects could be, and how you might approach that process. And we can discuss any lingering questions that you might have during the Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kate. Great, and next we're going to be joined by Rob Kraderoff of Kraderoff and Associates to talk a little bit about energy efficiency and kind of retrofitting your building to be more efficient in that way. Thanks for joining us today, Rob.
Thank you, Kevin. So today I want to present a high-level overview of options for houses of worship to more efficiently utilize their buildings and take advantage of some solar specific opportunities across the state. We're working with the New York State Council of Churches and its partners to provide no-cost technical assistance to property owners for opportunities with respect to on-site solar, energy efficiency, as well as subscriptions to off-site solar projects. So when we're talking about clean energy, then there are really two different markets across the state, largely speaking, upstate and downstate. In upstate New York, which broadly defined would be northern Westchester and northbound, westbound would constitute really provides an opportunity for property owners to sign up to off-site solar projects that are called community solar. What that means, some of you might have seen that there are large solar projects being built in fields, and many of those projects are looking for property owners and individuals to sign up as a subscriber. What that means is they'll essentially take a look at how much you're paying each year in electricity and then provide a 10% discount off of your bill. These savings are guaranteed. It's using a bill crediting system that's specific for community solar. It works very well. We've worked with Catholic Charities. They're saving about $160,000 over the life of their agreement with Community of the Holy Spirit. Part of what's interesting about this opportunity as well is congregations can reach out to their community members and also their congregations to offer them to sign up and begin a conversation around what it means to have clean energy. In addition to off-site opportunities, there are, of course, on-site opportunities to improve buildings. One is an on-site solar project. So we will work with faith-based organizations to size the system, to look at the payback, to consider roofing and electrical conditions. How practical is it? How feasible is it? What's the time frame that is practical? Second, and relatedly, are other energy efficient improvements. Really, ideally, one looks at those together. Here we can help you think through not just what are the improvements that could be made, but what are the different project financing opportunities. So moving to the next slide. And to talk about some financing opportunities, both in New York City and the financing considerations also can extend upstate. There's direct ownership opportunities to come out of pocket and purchase. There also are third-party financing and the ownership arrangements where another entity can come in and pay for the system and provide a discount to the property, or a lease payment, or both. Around energy efficiency in New York City in particular, there is local law 97, which is a property specific carbon emissions cap. And if a property exceeds that, there are substantial penalties. So this is for properties 25,000 square feet and larger. So if you fall into that category, then now's the time to start thinking about it. The earliest compliance period is 2024, which is really right around the corner when you consider what it takes to evaluate and finance and implement improvements. To consider different energy efficiency financing arrangements. There are ways that on the property tax bill, even if you're not paying property taxes, it's possible to finance a project through the savings. Essentially, the savings are greater than what you owe on your property bill. So there's an arrangement there. There are specialized debt sources. And there are also third-party financing for energy efficiency specifically, where a third party can come in and offer an efficiency improvement at no cost, and then you can get a discount on what you're paying for electricity. So there are benefits and trade-offs of all of these, and you really want to understand the benefits and trade-offs of each of financing opportunity. Does it make sense to own or have another party come in? There are sometimes gut reactions. The numbers may dictate otherwise. And also your capacity as an organization to finance and implement different types of improvements. So at that, I will kick it back to Kevin.
Great.
We're happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I just want to add that, of course, these sorts of energy efficiency initiatives are not like mutually exclusive to things we've discussed before. If you're pursuing an affordable housing or adaptive reuse, as Kate talked about, those are also things that you can implement some of the things Rob talked about. Great, so next, I do want to talk briefly with Mark Greenberg about some sorts of advocacy initiatives that different congregations might take on. Development isn't always an appropriate solution for everyone. So can you talk about these sorts of non-development advocacy avenues that people pursue? Oh, Mark, you're muted.
You're right. How'd that happen? Sorry. Thanks, Kevin. I think for everybody who's on this call, if you're interested in learning about the potential of developing affordable housing on your property and you're with a faith group, you're probably also interested and concerned about homelessness and housing. And as Kevin said, there are many things that each of us can do, and particularly those of us in faith communities, that can do to address the issue of homelessness and housing. And so what I always like to remind people of is that the issue of homelessness and housing really has two aspects. One is the personal aspect, where people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness clearly are traumatized and in need of direct service and in need of compassion and in need of being acknowledged. That's the first side, the personal side, and we must do what we can locally and with the person in front of us. And of course, congregations do that magnificently with their emergency food programs, with their overnight shelters, with providing social services and so on. But the other side is advocating, is changing this, is the systemic work of changing public policy that impacts on those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And this is something that Peter and I have been doing for many, many years. We've had some great successes. And I like to remember a quote from Louis Pasteur, who said, "Fortune favors the prepared mind." So it's often important to understand the landscape of policy, and then you can learn when there's an opportunity to have an impact. And just to go over some recent successes, as some of you may know, New York City provides a rental subsidy to those who are in shelters. But until recently, that subsidy was not sufficient for most people to find housing. In fact, out of the 16,000 vouchers that were out there, there are only 500 apartments a year that were rented for those vouchers. So if someone would have a voucher, it was like an empty piece of paper. But through the advocacy of Peter and myself and many of our allies and some great leadership in the city council, that voucher is now increased to the point where there are now 75,000 apartments in New York City that can be rented for that voucher. Now, the other problem is that landlords sometimes will not want to accept a potential tenant with a voucher or with other form of income, and that's against the law. But that is difficult to prosecute. So that's one of the things we need to be doing. But in addition to the city voucher, the state voucher called FEPS, FHEPS, was also increased, which means that many families around the state will now have an option to rent housing that they could not before. And that is not only for people in shelters, but people who are in need of additional housing, particularly women who are victims of domestic violence. This voucher would give them an opportunity to move into another apartment at a higher rent level and leave their abuser. And then there's also these emergency housing vouchers that have come through, 8,000 from the federal government. These are Section 8 vouchers, so they're guaranteed by the federal government for 10 years. And we're actually now working with enterprise community partners to identify landlords through our faith network who would be open to learning about renting to tenants, potential tenants with those vouchers. So if any of you are interested in talking further with us about that, about speaking to your congregation, speaking to your denomination, about identifying landlords who'd be willing to be part of the solution, we'd love to talk to you about that. And I just want to say, in addition to advocating for public policy, and I invite we will be in touch with each of you since you've registered. We hope that we can continue to communicate with you about the advocacy options that there are. But in addition to that, an issue that's come up recently is the whole question of citing affordable housing and homeless facilities in your neighborhoods. And we have done some extensive work with what we call our hospitality initiative to, as Peter was saying, to identify those people in need as our neighbors and work to make sure that the facilities being placed in our neighborhoods are the right kinds of facilities that truly care for those in their walls, and that they're welcomed by the neighbors and supported by the neighbors. And there are some great examples of neighbors being supportive of these facilities, developing incredible relationships. Everyone benefits. We can all understand that someone who's isolated and homeless and now placed in a facility, the last thing in the world they need is to be treated to be shunned by the neighbors. We need to welcome each other, and in the right kind of facilities, people can be happy. As my friend who has been homeless for many years, who's on our board, says, Mark, if there are no problems in the building, there'll be no problems in the neighborhood. So we can be sure that the facility is run properly, the neighbors can be very supportive. And so I think there's a lot we can do in addition to providing housing on our property. We all can play a role in making sure that this city is much more welcoming for those who are most in need. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Mark. Great. So now we have some time for questions. I'll just kind of bring everyone back here. But I saw we had one question from Kimley about kind of 501c3s, and also a question earlier up also mentioning 501c3s. Jason, would you mind just doing a quick summary? I saw you said something in the chat, but I think everyone would love to hear about that.
Sure. So and let me set the stage a little bit, right? So if you're a faith-based organization, particularly, and forgive me for sounding callous against other religions, the word used by the Internal Revenue Code is church. So I'll refer to it as church, even though it applies to all sort of houses of worship. The churches are, as you likely know, or much of the audience knows, are presumptively exempt. And the purpose of a church, though, is worship. In order to attract grants, the federal government and frequently members of your community, so not just the federal government, all levels of government, municipal, state, and federal, frequently prefer a secular, and I'm sure I'm misusing that. I've been corrected in using how I use secular by Reverend Patrick Dugan frequently, so forgive me. But by creating a secular 501c3, a secular not-for-profit, the mission of which is to engage in some sort of community support. Can be homelessness alleviation, can be housing, can be food programs, can be economic development, can be all of the above, can be other things. I'll use a particular example. So Judson Memorial Church in Union Square, in Washington Square in Manhattan, decided that it wanted to use a 501c3 to attract local donations and federal and grants. They undertook a very thoughtful process with a not-for-profit consultant to create a business plan, and we were their counsel, to identify the limitations of that 501c3 and the powers and authorities it would have. Because, as I stated in the chat, one, frequently that 501c3 will, it doesn't have to, but depending on whose money you want to attract, you will have members of the community that are not members of your church on the board of that 501c3. In Judson's case, they contemplated the Greenwich Village Historical Society and NYU. Those individuals are not going to have exactly aligned interests or a history or cultural as the same as the church. Similarly, if that not-for-profit is going to get grants, particularly capital grants, and capital grants are for construction, that not-for-profit is going to have a lease or a full-on ownership right, in most cases, in the property. And that may not be something that the church wants. Or it may want, but it may be something that you want to engage in very thoughtfully and have explored all your options first. So the bottom line on all of this is 501c3s are great. Once you know what it is specifically that you are trying to achieve, and you have thoughtfully constructed with your own leadership and ideally with consultants, the structure of that not-for-profit 501c3 and how it fits into the church's larger vision.
Thank you, Jason. That was really helpful. I see we have a question from Valerio or Sally. Do you want to unmute and kind of ask your question? Oh, you're muted still.
Oh, I'm not. Okay.
Okay. There
Thank you
are.
very much. I appreciate this whole workshop. It's been very interesting and educational. I have a couple of legal questions. I'm the project director for This Land Is Ours Community Land Trust, one of the newest land trusts in New York City, and we're looking to work with religious institutions to convert their property to low-income and very low-income housing in perpetuity. In covering the legal arguments that goes to how covered so well, there was one thing that was not mentioned, and that is outright disposition of a church property requires approval from the New York State Attorney General's office. And it hovers around the issue that the DAG wants to ensure that that church.
I breathe one time, I'm done.
Oh, sorry. Let me just see.
Right, it's fine with me.
Okay, I muted that errantly unmuted person.
Okay.
We can continue.
The DAG is primarily concerned not so much with the proposed use as the proposed sale price that has to be fair market value, which makes it difficult in terms of raising necessary funds to acquire and to redevelop the property. The question I have is, would some of these problems be obviated if the church is a co-developer along with a nonprofit, we're a 501c3, for example? And if the church is to get benefit from it, can it be part of the project, or does it have to be conduit out, as you suggested in one of the scenarios you were discussing? How do we go about, to deal with the issue of church and state separation?
Thank you. That seems like a Jason question.
Yeah, hi Val. So we could talk more. We could talk more about this later. So there's a couple things I want to establish. So one is some, as I mentioned, some denominations require approval of the Attorney General and or the court, although realistically they usually require the court's approval. And the court always requires the Attorney General. And then if you're a mainline denomination, Catholic, Episcopalian, Methodist, for example, Presbyterian, there's adjudicatory that approves the transaction, and the Attorney General does not. The statutory standard is that the consideration be fair, reasonable, and in the best interest of the religious corporation at the time that the agreement was made, the contract was signed. There is, well, let me finish that and then I'll come back to the exception. The Attorney General, especially, and I think the other denominations that are the other tracks that don't require Attorney General approval, usually want a certainty that the consideration will be received. And in determining what's fair and reasonable, the Attorney General at least usually requires an appraisal by an independent appraiser issued to the religious corporation. And they usually like to see that the property was marketed widely. And so it's not just what is being delivered, but how it's being delivered. And so if the developer, if the church is a religious corporation or a faith-based organization is being made a co-developer, but the consideration, the money's being paid, it is uncertain, you are likely to have a harder time getting Attorney General approval. But here's the punchline. A faith-based, and some faith-based organizations are going to be overjoyed to hear this, and some, Val, I think that you're thinking about may not. The law allows, and I have yet to bring this to the Attorney General, but it is in the law. The law allows a faith-based organization, or religious corporation, excuse me, it is defined as a religious corporation in the statute, allows a religious corporation to transfer its property for nominal consideration if the transfer is in furtherance of its purpose and it is to an exempt organization. So that is to say that by statute, if you had a willing partner on the other side, a religious corporation that wanted to give the property to this joint venture for nominal consideration, and that that joint venture was a not-for-profit, it could be exempt. The issue that you'll get into, which is the 201 and 301 course of this, which we could talk about after, is that when you have a tax credit investor in affordable housing, that is not a not-for-profit entity. That by definition is a for-profit entity, so that the investor can reap the tax credits, and that's where you run into the statutory difficulty.
Great. Thank you, Jason. So I think we have a few more things that we'd love to cover with you all. So we're going to move on from these questions. You can always email me at kevin@judson.org if you have anything else, but we'll kind of go through a few more things before we get to any more questions. After you kind of do this discernment process, where you figured out what sort of development is appropriate and desirable for your congregation, you're going to want to start like assembling a team to help you with the sorts of next steps of the development process. In IAHC's, the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaboratives context, this involves finding a sort of pre-development coordinator. Peter, would you tell us a little bit about this role and what they would do?
Okay. So what we want a congregation to avoid at all costs is not enter into a development agreement with any developer until they are ready to do that. And do not sign anything, do not precipitously move in that direction. This whole thing that we're doing is designed to help you get in touch with your mission, look at all of your options, be clear about what you own, your assets, and so on. All of that happens in what we call phase one, which is what we've spent a lot of time talking about with you today. Now, out of those conversations, some of you will decide that, yes, you could look at building affordable housing on your property. And in order to do that, you need to make, if you want to have money that can help you prepare to formulate what's called an RFQ or an RFP, you need to prepare an application. It could come to us at the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, or it could come to some other entity. But if it comes to us, we have a very prescribed process through the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative. So what we would need to ask you to do is to identify a pre-development coordinator who could help you prepare an application, and also to approve the pre-development coordinator's qualifications to prepare that application, particularly if that individual will be performing pre-development services like legal or architectural services. That person is somebody who you want to have well qualified, who is familiar with affordable housing development. So for instance, you might not want to have a personal injury attorney helping you prepare an application.
Right.
And so anyway.
Cool. And also during this process, you'll be working with a variety of professionals, most likely the sorts of legal professions and also architects. And Jason has a few slides to kind of go over what to look for in those sorts of professionals as well. And
Great.
I'll
So
pass it to you.
thank you, Kevin. So I mean, I think for most of the projects or options, or Peter uses the word tracks that we've talked about, at least everything short of advocacy, you are likely to need an attorney and an architect. In some, you may not, right? You may not need an architect for the solar track, but you know, you'll likely want an attorney to review that. And same thing with, depending on what you're doing with your property, you want an attorney involved in structuring your agreements with whoever's using your property or renovating your property. And depending on the scope of work, you may want an architect. Specifically with regard to the Interfaith, IAHC, in the scope of the recoverable grant or forgivable loan, different name, same result, requires you to have at least these professionals in order to undertake the scope, which is to evaluate your property, and once evaluated and confirmed that it is appropriate for development of affordable housing, to establish a request for proposal, an RFP that will go out to the development community. Here are your two types, at the risk of telling you what you may already know, of consultants that you'll need is an attorney and an architect. And attorneys will help you sort of what I've done, hopefully so far, and laid out many questions and only some of the answers, but will help you understand what you own, how you own it, how it can be used legally. They'll also review your corporate documents and make sure that how you are doing business actually is in conformance with your corporate documents. And if it's not, help you make sure that they are aligned, whether that means revising your corporate documents, revising your structures and processes, or a combination of the two. As I mentioned, they'll help you create legal agreements and structures to realize your goals. Could be licenses, could be leases, could be contracts with the architect, with the general contractor to perform the work, etc. And importantly, they'll help you evaluate risks And a lot of what the law was that I don't think I realized before I was an attorney is creating documents, evaluating risk, and creating documents and agreements to assign that risk, to address that risk and assign that risk. So to the contractor, to the architect, to the developer, et cetera. Right? Just like I mentioned to Val, the risk of not getting compensated for selling your property, for instance, who has that risk? That needs to be identified by the attorney and set forth in the agreements. The architect will on the other side now not look just at the legal agreements, but look at what building and zoning law allows in your property, what your space use needs are, right? Are you using your sanctuary only 20% of the time, right, in 4-dimensional space? So 3 dimensions of space and time. And could you be using it more efficiently? Maybe you don't have enough space or the right space for what it is you want to do. And then ultimately what could be produced on your property. And these consultants ought to work together to achieve whatever your goals are, and particularly with IAHC, if it is to apply for a grant or forgivable loan and create an RFP, they really need to work hand in glove to create this document and serve your goals. Next slide. And this is just, the next slide is, okay, how do I find a good one? So as Peter said, you don't want personal injury attorney handling your real estate matters. And forgive me, but you sort of, I'm jumping ahead here to will they, but you sort of get what you pay for frequently. So if you have a small matter, pro bono may make sense, but if you have something more involved, it is worth, I think more than worth, I think it is sort of your responsibility as leadership to make sure that you have that right experience, and frequently you're going to have to pay for it, and frequently it is money well spent. And jumping down to sort of the will they work with you on costs? Frequently at the end of whatever your goals are, there will be some sort of monetary event. So can payment to these professionals be deferred, at least in part, until that monetary event occurs if you are having, if this would otherwise be a strain on your budget. So anyway, to run through this list in the order that it's there, when you're evaluating attorneys, architects, and other consultants, do they have the experience in your specific matter, right? In development, if you're doing leases or mortgages, renovation, energy agreements, like what we talked about with Rob, have they done this before? And not only have they done it with faith-based organizations, right? Because that is a whole different area of law. It's important that you understand both of them. And then, if it's affordable, have they done affordable? As I mentioned, low-income housing tax credits, governmental funders, et cetera. Have they worked with those institutions and understand it well enough to evaluate the risks, as I mentioned? And same thing for market rate. I would argue market's a little bit simpler, or maybe a lot of bit simpler, but it is different players and different expectations in the industry. And certainly 100% get references and talk to them, find out what they liked, what they didn't like. No one is going to be 100% perfect, and so you want references that are going to be honest. As I mentioned, will they work with you on cost? Will they speak truth to power? If they tell you everything you want to hear, you might want to question whether or not they're being honest, right? They should present to you tough decisions, because in truth, there are tough decisions going to be made. You can't have, as I mentioned, that $200,000 sanctuary worth $200,000 in the marketplace and get a 3,000 person new sanctuary built for those $2,000 that you've got there, right? So how do we reconcile what it is that you want and what's there? They've got to be able to have those conversations with you. Will they represent your interests alone, not have any conflicts of interest? IAHC and Bricks and Mortals are very good at having partners sign ethics statements to make sure that this is true. And then are they licensed and reputable? Make sure architects and attorneys 100% have to be licensed. We actually had a church that had an unlicensed attorney who is now not doing anything and may have done some prison time. So very important to do your due diligence in advance. And then same thing for architects. They need to be licensed and reputable.
Well, thank you, Jason. the sun is now setting, and I'm sure we'll turn into pumpkins soon, but Peter is just gonna very quickly talk through the kind of what the rest of the process looks like. And we'll have another event in March that will go through these different later steps in more depth. But Peter, do you want to quickly talk us through these?
Yeah, so I just want to again emphasize that people should go to iahcny.org, where we go through all of these steps in detail, showing you exactly who to call and what you can expect at each phase. So please refer to that, and also to reach out to Kevin Ritter at kevin@judson.org to continue the conversation. So once you have prepared an application and that application has been approved and money awarded, then you can begin completing what we call scope of work, which is what's laid out in the application. So things like doing a property appraisal, doing zoning analysis, looking at potentials for financing and so on. All of that work is detailed in the application and approved. So now you're implementing what you represented in the application. Okay. Next slide. After you have collected all of this information with professionals, usually an architect and an attorney, they will help you put together an RFP or an RFQ, which is represented or marketed to potential development partners. And the recoverable loan or grant should get you up through the phase of developing that RFQ or RFP. Beyond the recoverable loan or recoverable grant or forgivable loan that we offer to you, there is a phase where once you have a developer who is interested in the RFP, then you will want to retain the services of an attorney who represents you and only you to negotiate a development agreement. Do not, I repeat, do not use the attorney of the developer with whom you are negotiating. You want to be sure that your interests are fully represented in designing and negotiating a development agreement. And then finally, once you've entered into a development agreement, if you set up a separate 501c3, which is entered into a partnership with a developer, and you have a development agreement, then you go into the implementation phase where you're seeking funding from government and private sources. There's no need for you before this point to be looking around for government money. That's something that the partnership does and that you do with a developer who has a reputation and an ability to secure those funds.
Great. So thank you, Peter, and thank you all for coming. If you have further questions, you can reach out to me at kevin@judson.org, or my phone number is listed there. And I will also be following up with the people who have sort of lingering questions in the chat. And I will send you an email because I have them all from your registrations. So thank you all for coming. I'll hang out for a few more moments, but that is the kind of formal end of our presentation. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. And I'm going to stop recording now.